Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so good evening everyone, and thanks very much for coming. It's really good to be back in Dublin again. A lot has happened since I was here last in February. If you think of all the things that are going on, sometimes it's a bit hard to keep track of it all, right? We've had, after February, I think pretty soon after that we had the Irish election, yes?
Mm-hmm.
We had, which was in the middle of the election campaign. And then we had of course the Arab Spring was already started by that point, and the Libyan situation got underway, and then we had the Japanese Fukushima event, and then we had the remarkable things which happened around May the 1st. You remember with the first there was the wedding event in England, the royal wedding, and then there was the same weekend the Pope John Paul II was beatified, and then also suddenly President Obama announced that he killed Osama bin Laden, and then of course proceeded to give us no real evidence of it whatsoever. But anyway, that all happened at the same weekend. And then of course the Arab Spring situation just continued to roll, and now of course we're in the Greek economic crisis, and who knows where that's going to end up. And then in the middle of all of that, at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of this month, we had the meeting of the Bilderbergers, the annual Bilderberger meeting in St. Moritz in Switzerland, and around about the same time a meeting of the Shanghai Organization, in which Russia and China are both members, along with a number of other Asian countries. So a tremendous amount has been going on there since that time. But underneath all of that is, in a sense, what I want to be talking about tonight, and that is what I think is the worsening situation really that is developing steadily between America and China. And I think this is the thing which is really going to be the main issue, if you like, for much of at least the first half of this century. And it was a rather similar situation in, say, 100 years ago, when of course there too you had remarkable things going on every year between, say, 1900 and 1914 in all the spheres, the arts, the sciences. But underneath all that was the building tension between Britain and Germany, which then of course eventually erupts in 1914. And it erupted because, in a certain sense, not enough people were aware of how that was not only building, but how it was even being stirred, if you will. And we'll come to that later, how that was done through the media of that time. So the situation then, USA and China, the looming vice, the coming conflict, is how I've titled this. And as you can see in this picture, the vice, the Earth, the planet, is in danger of, humanity in danger of being squeezed by these two huge powers. And perhaps we could just focus for a minute on these two pictures we see, because just look at the symptoms of those two pictures on the left and right there. On the left, the American picture, you have a single human figure, with a rather impersonal facial expression, dressed, of course, in classical Greek costume, representing a goddess figure coming from the Near East, and coming out of its head these 7 very pointed rays of light, and holding up a torch in the right hand, looking to the future, and then holding in the left hand the book with the date July the 4th, 1776. So in other words, America believes in the book, and what's written in the book will go forward as liberty enlightening the world, which is the title of the statue, into the future. One figure. And then on the right we have the Chinese dragon, because as you see here, although of course we could say this dragon is also going along the ground because it's being borne by this group of people, not one person but a group, and the gestures are all rather similar, as you can see, if they're carrying this paper dragon. But you can see from the person, there's one single character on the left who is, as it were, encouraging the people carrying the dragon, and in a sense leading and stirring them in the way it's being carried. And the Chinese dragon is often pictured vertically, flying in the air, as distinct from the Western dragon, which is often crawling along the ground or lives underground, sitting on a pile of jewels or something. And the Chinese dragon is often vertically flying in the air in the clouds, connected with the rain and the water, the elements of air and water. But the point here is, again, you have a mythical creature, and it's being born by the community. So by the group consciousness, if you will. And it's easy to imagine, as many people, particularly in the West, do, that here we have a contrast between the individual in the West and the group in the East, and that somehow this justifies the West in its opposition to these ancient group forces of the East. But I think we'll see that the picture's a bit more complicated than that. So, the image which we've been given by the Western media over the last, say, 10, 15 years of China by the US has gone through some important and significant changes, I think. So if you go back to, for example, 2007 here, you see on the left, America's fear of China, the panda, symbol of China, climbing the Empire State Building. These are both from The Economist. I mean, I always recommend people to read The Economist because I think that The Economist is one of the most significant indicators of planning, so to speak. The plans and intentions of the Western forces are often, elite forces are often revealed in various ways in The Economist. So if you follow it regularly and sort of train yourself to read between the lines, you start noting all sorts of leitmotifs which come up in The Economist. So here they're expressing this fearful relationship on the part of the West towards China. Of course, the Chinese panda, symbol of China, this is clearly a reference to the movie King Kong from the, I think that was the late 20s, around about 1930 period, but again, a time of economic crisis. 2007, our present crisis was then just looming, just before that crisis. And you see the Western helicopters in King Kong, it was biplanes, they're buzzing around about to attack. But King Kong was, of course, a kind of rediscovered prehistoric monster, a gorilla from deepest, darkest Africa, I think, yeah? But here, therefore, with this reference, the implication is that China, too, is a kind of prehistoric monster, which is climbing our empire state. And then we see on the right, Uncle Sam and Chairman Mao in bed together. And you can ask yourself, well, what kind of relationship is that? But clearly, whereas Mao has got this kind of the classic inscrutable Oriental look on his face, sort of serene half smile, and arms folded, and looking straight ahead, Uncle Sam is looking nervously in Mao's direction. So the nervousness and the apprehension is on the Western side. But both of them, although they're in bed together, they're surrounded by their weapons. However, the interesting thing is you see the rose there has been placed between them. And from the angle of the rose, it's not altogether clear who's placed the rose there, whether it's Mao who's placed the rose or Uncle Sam. I would hazard a guess that it seems possibly to have been placed there by Mao. But when we sort of go on a couple of years, we see that this image has taken a sort of a turn for the worse, you might say. From unease and discomfort, it's now gone into something a bit more sinister. So here we have, from 2010, now it's, the impression is given that the poor, minuscule, powerless almost, leader of the free world, supposed to be the most powerful man on the planet, we're always told, Barack Obama is staring into the mouth of this colossal Chinese metallic dragon about to eat him, facing up to China. And then on the right we see a young Chinese soldier gazing through a weapon or gun sight. And clearly the implication here is that the target is the West. The dangers of a rising China. So finally, it really comes out. The economists are saying, well, China is really the danger here. So, and this is really where we are at the moment. China is now being clearly signalled to us as the danger. This was exactly the situation 100 years ago when the powers in Britain were seeing Kaiser Wilhelm's Germany as the rising power, and they were concerned that they were the declining power. And how can they hang on to their position and defend themselves and the British Empire against what they saw as the German threat? And we'll see later on that many of the American think tankers and the leading foreign policy specialists and so on, this is exactly how they're seeing the Chinese-American relationship today in terms of Britain versus Germany 100 years ago. So America as the British Empire of today, and China as the German Empire of today, the rising power. Yeah, so there's the situation there. This figure drawn from the Near East, which is an interesting phenomenon in itself, but the symbol of America is this Near Eastern goddess from the world of Iraq, Babylonia. These cultures, yes, dressed, but however, in Mediterranean, Greco-Roman costume. Some people have said, well, the figure of the Statue of Liberty is based on Semiramis, Babylonian goddess. Others have referenced Isis, but it's clearly a goddess from that part of the world. And of course, this statue was actually a gift from the Freemasons of France to the Freemasons of the United States. People in America usually learn in school that this was a gift of the people of France to the people of the United States. But in fact, if you look into it, it was a gift of the Freemasons of France to the Freemasons of the United States. And the man who designed it and created and built it in France was a Freemason, and the people who, as it were, received it in America and dedicated it and consecrated it were all Freemasons. And of course, it's standing on this colossal plinth, which is itself a large cube, extended cube, the cube which is so important within Freemasonic ritual. And then you see this very interesting 11-sided base, which is 11-sided base, which the whole thing is standing on. It's number 11. I won't go into that now, but it's just something to conjure in. It's a very unusual number for a geometric arrangement in an architectural arrangement like this. You usually see things in Western culture based on 3s and 4s and 7s and 5s and 6s, but 11 is most unusual. Yeah. So I'd like to maybe, just that by way of some introduction, I'd like to focus on this relationship between the East and the West, the US and China, from the point of view of point and periphery. Or to put it another way, what is the relationship between this point and the periphery, that there is a kind of, what is there in the middle? What joins the point and the periphery? Because that's obviously missing in this sun symbol. Yeah. And I think we can say that what in a certain sense is missing between the point and periphery is the spiral, or the vortex. And if you look down from the periphery, down into the point, then you're kind of looking into a tightening Gaia or spiral or vortex form. And we see this form, of course, in nature in different ways, in the clouds and water vortices and so on. And we see it in symbology in various cultural manifestations. Here, for example, in the Caduceus. Different forms, even though in a sense this is reversed, that the two snakes are sort of climbing up. But the whole form is you're rising from a point up to this, the periphery at the top, the widening perspective of spirit, as it were, at the top, the wings at the top there. And in the middle of this whole process, we see in the Caduceus, the straight line between these two forms going around the spiral, and the straight line of the eye there in the lemniscate joining these two realms, the point and the periphery. And we can think of point and periphery, we see it in various cultural manifestations. So obviously the Chinese yin-yang symbol, we can think of that also as point and periphery in a particular form, a curvaceous form. But in the west of Asia, I mean, we normally associate this, the hexagram, we see it, for example, in the flag of Israel. And we can see that as a twofold, as a two-dimensional representation of interpenetrating vortices. So two vortex coming from above down to the point, and then the opposite, and they're meeting in the center, as we see there at the top. So both in the far east of Asia and the west of Asia, we can see this gesture of point and periphery. I think we can think of point and periphery in terms of fact in the West. So we often say, what's the point? Can you get to the point? Maybe some of you are thinking, can I do that right now? Can I get to the point? But in the West, we say, well, come on, what's your point? Get to the point. And that's not something which is said in the East. I best of all, I suppose I know Japan, familiar with Japan, and it's not an expression that they use in Japan, to come to the point. It's more this peripheral consciousness of really starting from the out there, as it were. And that corresponds in a certain sense within our Western culture, you could say, to our ancient consciousness of symbol, myth, archetype, which is represented here by the dotted line, which is open to that which comes in from the outside. So if we look at this relationship between East and West, from this sort of mythical, archetypal perspective, and look at these points and periphery from a different side, we can see them again here in architecture. And if you look at clearly the building on the left, which is again the Empire State Building, and if you ask yourself, well, where is the center of that building? Now, where's the center of it? I think one could say that the center of it is clearly somewhere lower down, close to the ground. And out of that point of center, it strives up. Yeah? But if we ask ourselves, where is the center of the Chinese building on the right? Then, anybody like to hazard a guess where it is, where it could be?
Up from the ground.
Yeah, yes. Up from the ground, yeah. But, how high up from the ground? I mean, it's interesting that it's nice that this particular picture shows the reflection in the water, right? If you transpose the reflection in the water, where you see that ball at the bottom, and then stick it on the ball on the top, yeah? So again, you've got kind of two vortex picture. The center of the Chinese pavilion is actually at the apex. So the center of the Chinese, of this, is actually up here in space. It's not in the physical building itself. So the Chinese roofs, in doing this, they're actually opening up to the heavens. And that's where their orientation is, if you'll forgive the pun. It's literally up there. Yeah? And it's interesting, if you compare Chinese roofs and buildings to Japanese, you see a kind of, another step has been taken, because Japanese buildings are never like this, even though their architecture is Chinese influenced. The gradient is much gentler. So the Japanese buildings, the gradient will be sort of like that, you see. Whereas the Chinese are really still much more oriented up to the periphery. And some Japanese buildings are even virtually almost straight, and then you even get some very old ones that actually even convex. So you see a culture that's come down more to earth in a certain sense. Now when we come to the West, I think we can see this archetypal. I'm just starting here in myth and archetype, you see, and then later I'm going to come to the actual facts of what's going on between America and China today. Here we have the famous painting School of Athens by Raphael, the Italian Renaissance painter. And we see on the right there, or rather in the center of the painting itself, with all these Greek philosophers he's representing, the two arguably most important, Plato and Aristotle. and we see Plato on the left, sorry, well, yeah, on the left from our perspective, with his hand pointing up. And he's holding in his left hand a copy of the book, which is usually said to be the Timaeus, in which we find the first descriptions of Atlantis. That book. But he's pointing upwards, and he's wearing red and very light purple. That probably doesn't come out quite so much here, but a light purple shirt. Whereas Aristotle, we see he's pointing down, yeah, and he's holding his book horizontally, and that's usually said to be the Nicomachean Ethics. So ethics teaches human beings how to live in this world, in society. So these two philosophers are, in a sense, you could say that arguably Plato is the last of the last of Asia, so to speak. He's still oriented to the spiritual world, and Aristotle his focus is down to the physical world. We get the beginnings, in a certain sense, of science there in the meetings of these two men. The orientation is down to this world with Aristotle. And that's a very important meeting where, in a certain sense, European Western culture begins to part company with Asian culture in its focus very much on this world, whereas in general one could say Asia is still, and particularly the further east you go, is still oriented up to the spiritual world. And then I'm just going to pick out a few what I think are symptomatic events in the development of the relationship between China, or East Asia, let's say, and the West, just coming up to today. Just a few symptomatic developments through the ages, just as a sort of background to this present state of Chinese-American relationship. So here we have, again by Raphael, Pope Leo, who is shown here on horseback, and he's confronting Attila the Hun. So Attila, the Huns, of course, we have to remember, were not Chinese. The Chinese saw the Huns as barbarians. Yeah? The Huns were, well, actually historians are not quite sure who the Huns were. Some people say they were sort of Turkic people, some argue they were sort of Mongoloid people, but actually the jury's still out on that. They're not quite sure really who the Huns were. Yeah? But anyway, they certainly came from what is now, we could say, the borders of Western China, Tajikistan, this sort of area, and moved powerfully across the whole of Eurasia and arrived very strongly in Europe. So here, Attila, who's shown here, is being confronted by Pope Leo, the famous scene where Pope Leo is said to have, as it were, used his spiritual power to keep, to frighten Attila away, and Attila and the Huns then sort of retreat from Rome. But the interesting thing about this, also for me, is that this is the time in the 5th century, the middle of the 5th century, when many of the Europeans fled from the invading Huns. And some of those who fled were the people who then founded the city of Venice. So the origins of Venice were at this time, when people who fled from the Huns to the lagoon area of Venice, where they were safe, protected by the waters and the marshes, you see, from the horses of the Huns. And when we follow that, the role of Venice, as we'll see in a minute, in this relationship between China and the West, something very interesting takes place, because Venice is somewhere where East and West very strongly interact. So, for example, we come then to Marco Polo on the left. Yeah? So here we're now in the 13th century, and of course, as you know, Marco Polo, now we're with the Mongols have come to Europe this time, yeah? Again, all the way from the same part of the world, not Chinese, again regarded by the Chinese as barbarians and nomads, but they have still, like the Huns, powered across Eurasia, and they turn up in Europe and they defeat the entire armies of European chivalry. Europe is powerless to defeat the Mongols. So the Europeans are saying, well, who are these people? So the Pope again sends various people across to China to try and find out, or East Asia to find out, who are these people? And as I'm sure you know, some of the people who decided to go and find this out for themselves were the Polos. And where did they come from? Venice. So Marco Polo and his father, they go all that way over there. And what comes out of this in the end? So they find the court of Kublai Khan, who's the Mongol emperor of China, who's now conquered China, and the Mongols are then being Chinesified, you might say. Their nomadic, somewhat primitive culture was being influenced by Chinese sophistication, becoming Chinesified. And Marco Polo writes down all his experiences, and then who reads this book, which he writes, Il Milione, the story of his travels to China? Who reads this book 200 years later and heavily notes, makes comments and notes on this book, as we know now, because we've seen copies of it? Well, that's the guy on the right, who is, you will recognise him? You will recognise the man on the right of the picture here?
Columbus.
Columbus, yeah. Christopher Columbus. So Columbus is inspired by Marco Polo to then go and also look for China. But what does he find? He heads in, as it were, the opposite direction, the so-called wrong direction, and he meets something totally different. He meets America. Yeah, which is one of the weirdest things in, well, the history of the last 1,000 years, I'd say. He meets something completely different. And almost immediately we find that the Europeans get caught then by what America seems to offer, which is above all gold and silver. Yeah? So Marco Polo is impressed by the splendor of the Chinese court in all sorts of different ways, from its sophistication, its philosophy, its religions, its everything. But by the time we get to Columbus, European civilization's got to the point where it's focused particularly on material gold and silver and riches. But between these two guys, something else really interesting happened in this East-West relationship, because the chap in the middle there might not be so familiar to you. This is Admiral Zheng He. Now we're at the time of Henry V in Western European history, so that's about the beginning of the 15th century. And at that time, Admiral Zheng He was sent by the Emperor of China to explore the whole, well, basically to take out the message of Chinese culture as far as he could. So in vast ships, you can just see one of them behind him, this colossal ship here, which is about 10 times larger than any European ship at the time. A huge fleet of these ships was sent out from China to explore the entire Indian Ocean, what is now we call the Indian Ocean, and the whole coast of East Africa. So the Chinese really reaching out to explore the world at that time. Yeah? And this is the same emperor who built the Great Wall, which we now see, and the same emperor who built the Great Grand Canal that we now see, and the same emperor who built the Forbidden City in Beijing, which we now see. So a very special individuality. He's the guy who sent out Admiral He. But then something weird happened, because this emperor, in the end, reigned only about 20 years. And then when he died, something happened which often does happen in history. His son makes the exact opposite gesture. So his son then decides, no more of this. We're going to close off now. And so the Chinese then actually began to close down all these operations. So no more ships were sent after about the 1430s. And China does not, it looks overwhelmingly back towards the past and its ancient roots, so to speak. But in the West, on the other hand, at exactly the same time, this man at the bottom, anybody recognise him? Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal, right. So here we see the Portuguese beginning to open up, and Prince Henry sends all the ships out from Portugal to explore the ocean. So just at the time when China closes down, the West then begins to open up. That's another rather mysterious relationship between these two parts of the world. And of course, many people are of the view, and there seems to be a lot to back this up, but I can't go into this now, it would lead us too far afield, that Prince Henry the Navigator was of the stream of what was called the Order of Christ, sort of knightly order, yeah? And that itself was a metamorphosis of the Knights Templar, who had been suppressed by the Pope 100 years before. They changed their name in Portugal and became the Order of Christ. And this is why often many of the ships that were sent out had the Templar Red Cross on their sails. So it's from Portugal, that country which is now experiencing so many difficulties. This is the country that actually led the way out into the world by the European powers. Of course, you can say, what about the Vikings? We mustn't forget them, but in a certain sense they stopped. Yeah? It was really the impulse that led from the Portuguese, which took Europe into, for example, the Indian Ocean, into Asia. And then also the Portuguese, who they took with them on their travels, were the Jesuits. So again, here we have something interesting, because you may know that the Order of the Knights Templar, they owed obedience only to the Pope. They were an international order, the Templars, yeah? So they were sworn to obedience only to the Pope. But in a certain sense, we could argue, and many people have argued, that the Templars, in what they were doing in the Middle East, in Jerusalem, in the Holy Land, were actually in a certain sense seeking to emancipate themselves from the control, central control of the Vatican. And so they had this international perspective, and they were, of course, warriors as well. Now, the interesting thing with the Jesuits is that they were rather similar, because the Jesuits were founded by a warrior, and they had a military origin, and even today they're still run by a general. And whereas the Templars the knights were dressed in white, the Jesuits are known to be dressed in black. And they were absolutely disciplined, like the Knights Templar. They called themselves a company, military term, and they were absolutely obedient to their general, who was then absolutely obedient to the Pope. And again, like the Templars, they had a supranational perspective. They were active all over the world. Now, I don't wish to say that therefore, because of these similarities, these two orders were the same thing. But it's just interesting to see how, as it were, the white turns into the black in these two orders. Yeah? There's some interesting similarities there, but it's also obviously important to consider differences. Now, from 1540, when the Jesuits were founded, very quickly, because the Europeans and the Portuguese were already out there in Asia, the Jesuits followed, went with the traders, and established themselves in Japan and China. So, and the Jesuit gesture here was very interesting, because their gesture of the Jesuits was always to get under the skin of the people who they wished to convert. So they didn't go and lecture to them, thou shalt become Christian because Christianity is best. They actually sought to learn the languages, learn the customs, and they were able to do this because of their incredible discipline and their long-term perspective, and get inside the habits and life patterns of the people they sought to convert. Yeah? And so here we see one of the most famous there on the left, Jesuits, Matteo Ricci, late 16th, early 17th century in China. And it was the Jesuits really to whom we owe the knowledge of China that came to Europe in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. And they wrote a number of famous books: Confucius, the Philosopher of the Chinese, Description of China, Edifying Curious Letters, 34 volumes. I mean, these people they studied the Chinese culture and wrote copiously about it, sent reports back to Europe. And it was really from the Jesuits that the men of the Enlightenment and the Baroque period learned about China. Memoirs on the history and sciences, the arts of the Chinese. Later in the 18th century, we find the French economist François Quesnay writing The Despotism of China. Despotism is a misnomer here. He wasn't looking at it negatively, like we would use this word despotism. He was just saying that China had a rational monarchy, and he regarded that as an incredibly good thing, and that the Chinese system and civilization was something from which Europe could learn. And indeed, we did learn quite a few things, including, for example, the civil service, of which the English are so fond, the civil service examination system, and so on. This is all learned from China. So we have the famous German philosopher Leibniz saying, I shall have to post a notice on my door, Bureau of Information for Chinese Knowledge. Because he saw there was so much to learn from China. Voltaire, the famous, again, French atheist and humanist, one need not be obsessed with the merits of the Chinese to recognize that their empire is in truth the best that the world has ever seen. So these people were impressed with China because it seemed not to be ruled by priests. It seemed to be ruled by men who had a kind of social, philosophical perspective, like Voltaire, like Leibniz. They thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if society were ruled by philosopher kings like me? And so they looked to China as a model. So in the Baroque Enlightenment period, China was very much something that they were interested in. Now here we come to something I think which is, I think you may find of interest. I find it of very great interest. And it's really an observation. It's not my own idea. It's something I've learned from the Austrian spiritual philosopher Rudolf Steiner, who was active about 100 to 90, 80 years ago. And his observation was in looking at the two individuals, King James of England, who originally King James VI of Scotland, then he became King James of England. He followed Queen Elizabeth I. So he begins reigning in 1603. And looking at the relationship between him and the Jesuit theologian, Francisco Suarez. And King James fancied himself as a scholar, theologian, and philosopher himself. And he wrote many, many tomes and educated books. And these two engaged in sort of philosophical combat across Europe as representatives of the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church. And in these various tracts that Suarez wrote, he basically argued like this. He said, the ruler of the world is God. Therefore we owe our absolute obedience to God. So if a king does not follow the laws of God, then it is justified for citizens of that country to get rid of the king, even to kill the king, to remove the king. Now, as you can imagine, King James, who is famous for believing in the divine right of kings and thinking that he himself was appointed by God, as it were, didn't take too kindly to that thought. Now, what then follows from this? Well, Steiner's observation was the following: that it was King James who was an extraordinarily important king in Britain, because it was from him that Freemasonry emerges in England, coming down from Scotland. James was, after all, a Scot. Yeah? And we know that James himself was initiated into Freemasonry in 1598. So 5 years before he became King of England. So with him and the Scottish aristocracy come down into England, Freemasonry, or the beginning, shall we say, of Freemasonry as we come to know it today. And Steiner's observation was that it is from this stream, stemming from James, that we get the origins in Freemasonry of what he could call the conservative secret societies, which then play such a role through Freemasonry, coming right down to organizations which operate behind the curtains today, such as the Bilderbergers and the Trilateral Commission. Elitists who are operating in an invisible or semi-visible manner, hidden from the masses of the people within democratic society. And within that process, we see here, I've indicated, you get groups like the Round Table, 1909, and then later, out of these groups comes more secretive organizations like OSSS, MI5, CIA, which exist to carry out the thoughts which are generated in these kind of secretive organizations and cabals, and carry them out into willed action in the world. But Steiner's point was that this is all stemming from a view of society which holds that society needs to be governed by, not by priests, but by a divine concept of aristocracy or monarchy. Yeah? So it's not a priesthood. Theocracy is an even older form than that. But rather, it is if you like, a divinely inspired monarchy, divinely inspired and endorsed aristocracy. And it is their will which is to be imposed upon the people. And they do that clandestinely, and that's the important point. Whereas from Suarez, Steiner was saying that from Suarez, who was, as I said, a Jesuit, yeah? What you then get is a completely different stream, in that you have the stream of the so-called, it comes down to the stream of the so-called Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt, who was Jesuit trained in Bavaria in the 1776. He founds the order of the Perfectibilists, as they were known, or better known by the name the Illuminati. And they operate, of course, to begin with, in a kind of clandestine way, but what comes from them is a stream of secret societies which is actually revolutionary. So they are saying that we have the right to overthrow all established order. So there's a certain sense, you see, that the stream coming from Suarez and the Jesuits is appealing to God, is appealing to something in the other world, divine sanction, to change the established order of the physical world, the social order of the physical world. And what happened with the revolutionary secret societies was, as they developed, this appeal to God kind of drops out, and they then develop an atheistic, this metamorphoses atheistically. So by the time we come into the 20th century, this is metamorphosed into Marxist organizations. But the point they have in common with the Jesuits is that just as the Jesuits felt that we have the knowledge, Jesuit order, or the Catholic Church, if you will, we have the knowledge given to us, as it were, from God, and we have the task, just like the Pope is the shepherd of the people, we have to shepherd the people. Yeah? But we shepherd the people from in front. So the Jesuits, even though obviously in their own meetings you could say they were discussing amongst themselves clandestinely, they were active in the world. They formed, obviously, schools. Education was one of the things that they were particularly known for. Yeah? You have situations like in South America, in Paraguay in the 17th century, where they found these missions where they train the natives in the Amazon, in the jungles in South America, and try to turn them into good Catholics who can play the violin and do all sorts of things that Europeans did. Yeah? So they had this concept that we have to lead the people from the front in a visible way. And the Bolshevik Marxist cadres have this same concept today. So in China, the Chinese Communist Party think of themselves as shepherding, leading the people from the front. Whereas in the West, our so-called democratic societies are actually being steered, guided and influenced from behind the curtain by groups of financiers, philosophers, occultists, military men, academics, who meet in secret or in semi-visible circumstances, yeah? Which the people don't really get to know about. Instead, there is a kind of democratic front or smokescreen put out there of politicians who the media tell us are the people who actually run the society, but actually it's guided from behind this curtain by these people who are coming from this Freemasonic stream, from the lodges, as it were, which is why Steiner spoke of the Western societies as the society of the people of the lodges. So I think this is an interesting perspective, which brings us down to where we are today, that the Western societies are, as it were, guided by these conservative elitists, on the one hand, who are acting in this semi-visible manner, semi-clandestine manner, and the the Chinese are being guided by these, well, in a sense, pseudo-Catholic or Jesuitical manner, do you see? And it's very interesting that the Jesuits were particularly successful in Japan and China. And these are the societies of the Far East. At least they were until those two societies decided to suppress Christianity and throw them out. So these are, I think, two of these streams which we can see. And you know, I put the Templars there at the beginning because, in a certain sense, both of these two streams, which we could say the Freemasons and the Jesuits, which in their own way are elitist and seeking to shepherd the people, they're very sort of one-sided. The point about the Templars is that they were operating out of what you could call a Christian esoteric perspective, but there was a certain sense in which they both almost owed something, if you will. They metamorphosed something, a kind of inheritance which came from the Templars in a kind of a fallen way, a kind of degenerate way. So, for example, we know that the Freemasons, their esoteric rituals are based on the Temple of Solomon and the geometry of the Temple of Solomon. And the Knights Templar, of course, were named after the Temple of Solomon. The Economist magazine, which I referred to earlier, The Economist is the only media organ which is allowed to attend Bilderberg meetings and reports on Bilderberg meetings. But of course they don't report to their readers about Bilderberg meetings. They only send the circulars which they write to the people who attend the Bilderberg meetings. So The Economist, in other words, knows what goes on at these Bilderberg meetings, but that knowledge is kept, as it were, in-house. Yeah? It's not communicated openly to the readers. So that's this gesture of keeping the knowledge to oneself. Knowledge is power. Okay, just a couple more historical symptoms. We find how the Chinese actually did eventually suppress or stop the Jesuit activities in China. But then we find that just as the Jesuits fade out, the Westerners in the English-speaking world then attempt to bring their impulse into China with, of course, the goal of making lots of money. So here we see Lord Macartney going to China in 1794. The English sail all the way around the world with all these ships loaded up with presents, material goodies to offer to the Emperor of China, who promptly sends them packing because they refuse to kowtow 9 times and touch their head on the floor, which is what you were supposed to do when you met the Emperor. The English were too proud to do that, so you see Macartney was only, he said, well, I bend to my king on one leg, that's what I'll do to the Emperor of China, I'll kneel to him on one knee, you see. He wouldn't do anything more than that. So that wasn't good enough for the Chinese. They said, well, we don't need your products, we have everything we need, and if you're not even civilized enough to bow in the correct manner, well, you go home. That was 1794. The English came again in 1816, repeated exactly the same mistake, so the Chinese sent them packing. So what then happened was, the English came back in the 1840s with gunboats. And you see an English steam-power driven, the latest technology on the right there, and they completely annihilate the Chinese Navy. And then, as you know, they forced the opium and the drug trade onto the Chinese because they had their own addiction, namely tea. Tea from China, right? So they needed silver in order to pay for the tea. So they therefore sold the opium from their Indian possessions illegally to China, collected the silver from China, for which they then paid for the tea from China. Bizarre trading relationship, right? But from that point on, the Chinese become hopelessly addicted to opium, and the century of humiliations begins, which is still quoted by the Chinese today. So here we see just 2 illustrations of that. On the right, we see Lord Elgin, of Elgin Marbles fame, the Second Opium War, and we see him smashing, or about to smash, a horrendous-looking Chinese dragon. This is from Punch magazine, right? And it's called What We Ought to Do in China, 1860. And you see Lord Elgin, of course, is dressed as a Greek, because the upper-class English men all went to public schools, elite private schools, where they learned the classics, and so the Victorian Englishmen saw themselves as Greeks, right? And so he's got this strange object with these two balls, and this great long stick. You know, there's a lot of suppressed sexuality in English Victorian public school ethos. You know, he's about to smash this Chinese with these two balls. Yeah? What we ought to do in China. We can ask, well, perhaps these two balls are in a certain sense a symbol of the hemispheric problem between East and West, which is already emerging. And on the left, we see in America, the Americans with their equal rights for all men kind of thing. The Chinese were, of course, brought in as coolies to build the Chinese railways. But the Americans weren't exactly appreciative of that, so after they laid the railways for them, well, out you go, you know, we don't want you anymore, no equal rights for you. So the Chinese are kicked off back home. The cornerstone, perhaps another Freemasonic reference there. And this, the sacking of the Summer Palace, which I just mentioned, is still a really important point today in the Chinese-Western relationship. Students for a good many years, and until 2005. And even today, the Chinese government is seeking to propagandize, if you would say, its people on the basis of nationalism. And one of the things it uses, because nobody really believes in communism anymore in China, except for the elite cadre of the Chinese Communist Party. So they use nationalism instead. And one of the things they use for this, they continually reference the century of humiliations which began with the Opium Wars. And sure enough, it's always the burning of the Summer Palace. And time again, my young students of 18, 19 and 20 would refer to the burning of the Summer Palace by Lord Elgin. So in other words, the Chinese haven't forgotten this. Or at least they're not allowed to forget it by their government. Whereas we've forgotten it completely in the West, yes. A century of humiliations. And what you see there, these buildings were actually designed by the Jesuits, or some of the Summer Palace buildings. And those were built in stone, so those are the ones that survived, or at least a bit of them survived. So here we see some Chinese young people taking photographs of what remained, a vast complex of buildings, which was sacked and burned by the French and the British troops in 1816. To finally come up to date, and then we'll take a break, with this sort of historical review. And then after the break, I want to look at the how the Americans are actually preparing their people for war with China later this century, and the dangers of that situation. We come to the early 70s. So, having gone through the century of humiliations, and what comes out of this is the Marxist revolution, which is a Western idea, of course, coming from the West. And then America brings it about in such a way that communism is allowed to succeed. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists are not supported sufficiently. The Mao and the communists are allowed to take control in China. So communism then fastens itself upon China. So this, as I say, this sort of Jesuitical, if you will, idea of a group which shepherds the people in a very rather brutal way. America comes back into the Chinese relationship in the early 70s. So President Nixon follows Henry Kissinger, who goes to clandestinely to China in 1971. Nixon then went to meet Mao in 72, and here we see Nixon in Beijing. And at the dinner, he gave a toast, and he said these words: "You believe deeply in your system, and we believe just as deeply in our system. It's not our beliefs that have brought us together here, but our common interests and our common hopes. And the interest that each of us has to maintain our independence and the security of our peoples, and the hope that each of us has to build a new world order." in which nations and peoples with different systems and different values can live together in peace, respecting one another while disagreeing with one another, letting history rather than the battlefield be the judge of their different ideas. Well, I think the West has sort of moved on from that, because I think Colonel Gaddafi at the moment would think, what? What happened about allowing our different ideas to exist? Now we've got to a stage where the West is imposing by war its will upon countries which want to have a different way of doing things. So then, the following year, the politicians having been, then the financiers come. So David Rockefeller then goes to China and meets with Zhou Enlai, the Maoist number 2. And Rockefeller says to Zhou Enlai, or rather he comments later on, coming back from China, I should say, in New York Times. Rockefeller writes this article. And he says there, and keep in mind, remember that figures perhaps differ, but clearly the Chinese Communist Party was responsible for the deaths of millions and millions of Chinese. Numbers vary between 30 to 60 million. Huge deaths resulted from Chinese Communist Party policy in China. What does Rockefeller say about China and this, what was going on in China? He says, whatever the price of the Chinese Revolution, whatever the price, it has obviously succeeded not only in producing more efficient and dedicated administration, but also in fostering high morale and community purpose. The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in human history. The social experiment. So that's how Rockefeller and these elite groups, which are influencing the West from behind the curtain, see what is going on in communism under the Marxist government there. It's a social experiment which is taking place. And so we've come from this situation, so then, of course, a few years later, then Deng Xiaoping takes over, the reform movement goes on right, in China. One interesting thing here is China's known, of course, for its one-child policy. But where did the one-child policy originate? If you look into the one-child policy, you'll see that around about 1974-75, the Chinese sent observers to Western meetings which were held by organizations such as the Club of Rome, which were focusing on the depopulation issue. Right? So they were talking about how can we reduce the world's population. And the Chinese were now starting to think in terms of how can we look beyond the Gang of Four era and move into the Chinese elite were jockeying for power in the middle of the 1970s. How can we move on from the Cultural Revolution into one of the things that came out of that was one of these technocrats then went back from these meetings in the West and recommends to the Chinese leadership that they should start to implement what they felt was the leading Western thinking about social engineering, namely depopulation. So in other words, this is another Western idea, you see, which came from these organizations led by these elite Western groups, such as the Club of Rome, speaking about how they can depopulate the world. And the Chinese then put that into operation on their own people as a gigantic transgenerational social experiment, which obviously hasn't yet completed itself, but is bound to have huge consequences. So when Deng Xiaoping then takes over and sets in the whole communist capitalism with socialist characteristics, as they like to call it, model in China, we're now at this situation where we find ourselves today, that the West is beginning to see China as a threat. So having sought to make money out of China, and they've certainly made a great deal of money out of China, in recent years, and we'll just look at this and then we'll just take a break. In recent years, from 1990 approximately, we see how step by step Western media are beginning to prepare the peoples of the West for eventual conflict with the Chinese. So we make money out of China, and then when we bring up China up to a certain point, and then we knock it down, and then we build it up in our own image, just as we did with Germany and Japan. So 100 years ago, the British people, for example, the British Empire, were encouraged through the media to see Germany as an enemy. War is then engineered with Germany. This becomes a 30 years war. Germany ends up being totally destroyed, and then Western business brings it up, builds it up again, and turns it into, in effect, our satellite. And what I would argue is that something is being prepared for China in the same way. So in 1990, again with The Economist, this is why I think The Economist is always so important, because they present, as it were, open secrets, where they almost communicate in a slightly backhanded way certain intentions. And they remember, this is the time of the end of communism, right? The early 90s. And they put forward this magazine, which I'll show you after the break, which speaks of how in the 21st century, what's going to be important is not economic ideology, but cultural ideology, religious ideology, spiritual, philosophical ideology. Struggle will take place around this, not around economics. And in China, they begin to speak of China as the Confuciania. So China is dominated by, not Marxism, but Confucian ideology. So they begin to seed this idea into the West that we have to think of the Chinese as being controlled by their ancient Chinese culture. 1992, and this. So then in 1997, we have one of the leading neoconservatives, Robert Kagan, writes "What China Knows That We Don't: The Case for a New Strategy of Containment." So the American elite begin to think of containing China as they had contained Russia in the Cold War. 1997, one of the, again, really key thinker in the American conservative elite, Samuel Huntington, the erosion of the American national interest in foreign affairs, the sort of in-house of the Council on Foreign Affairs, again is writing about the Chinese threat. 1997, Richard Bernstein, Ross Monroe, the coming conflict with America, China will be the United States' next major adversary. Again, Foreign Affairs magazine. 1998, Brian Beedham, who was for many decades the senior foreign affairs editor of The Economist, writes, he gives lectures titled The Atlantic Community in 2012, interestingly. There are 3 scenarios, one of which is conflict with China. 2001, Charles R. Smith, Newsmax.com, war with China. 2003, Willy Wellak Lam, China readies for future US fight, CNN. 2005, another leading American neocon, Robert Kaplan. Now it comes out direct, how we would fight China. And here he goes right into the tactical details, right down to cyber warfare, use of the military, use of the Navy, space, the whole thing. Nitty-gritty, how we would actually do it. That's 2005. Atlantic Monthly.
Sorry,
Again, high-profile American media.
Sorry. Why would he do that and let China know then how they would attack it?
Yeah, why would they do that? Why would they do that? Well, I'd like to leave that as a question for the time being, and maybe we can find a place where we can come back to that later on. 2005, another leading, this Robert Kagan again, the illusion of managing China. So you have the liberal elite of the American New World Order elite, saying like the likes of the Rockefellers and Soros, saying we have to integrate with the Chinese, we have to bind our economies together. And then the hard-nosed right wing of the same elite saying, no, we have to prepare for war with China. To manage China is an illusion. 2006, String of Pearls, meeting the challenge of China's rising power across the Asian littoral, Strategic Studies Institute. 2008, Robert Kagan again, behind the modern China, sarcastic reference there, is suggesting that China is really preparing for war with the West. 2010, Robert Kagan again, the perils of wishful thinking, basically the same message. And then this year, 2011, Glenn Beck, the very high-profile Fox News anchor and presenter, China as the Borg. Yeah, so that's really a sort of in-your-face message. I'm not a Star Trek fan, but Star Trek fans will know that the Borg are this sort of race of alien beings who are kind of like almost a sort of machine-like collective organism who go around the galaxy assimilating other peoples, and resistance is futile. You know, you cannot resist the Borg, right? So this very strong impression that, well, we Americans are the Captain Kirk and so on, we're the people of individuality, and the Borg are the faceless mass. And so Glenn Beck is saying, well, China is the Borg. So we Westerners who believe in freedom and democracy obviously have to, like St. George, prepare to fight the Borg, which is China. So this message given out very directly by Glenn Beck, even Alex Jones, who you might think, well, we know that he often argues against America preparing for war in the service of New World Order interests, and yet he is recently describing often China as a murderous slave camp and painting it in very one-sided dark colours, yes, which in a certain sense only serves to, again, generate the same kind of fear and paranoia. And one can ask, well, you know, is he really conscious of what he's doing there, or how he might be contributing to this this particular agenda of preparing the people for war with China? And this is exactly what was done 100 years ago in Britain, through the newspapers of that time, through books, through magazines, and all sorts of other little, you know, dramas and plays and penny dreadfuls and even priest sermons and this kind of thing. Germany, the Huns, the savages, the barbarians, the militarists, the darkness, the evil. We have to be on our guard, and so on. There's just now a few other pictures of how China is seen today in the West. This is New Dawn magazine, 1997. China versus globalization, the final war in the dark millennium. He writes there, what does globalism demand of China? Economically, to abandon socialism gradually and to embrace free trade right away. Politically, to abandon hopes of creating a Chinese-dominated Asian sphere of influence. Human rights and democracy are not a requirement. What, in fact, America seems to be doing with China is to consciously replay the interwar scenario, so with Japan, profit maximally from trade and investments in China, encourage US public opinion to maintain simmering hostility towards what may become a future enemy, tacitly facilitate China's military development, closer monitor developments, and most importantly, be sure that the US, together with its projected allies, maintains strategic dominance militarily, not least in space. Paul Rogers, the United States versus China, the war for oil. You know, already a number of observers are noting that what's happening in Libya, for example, right now, is really just a proxy war between America and China for the resources of Africa. You know, the Americans are kind of firing a warning shot across the bows of the Chinese, who we know are moving into Africa in a very savvy way, basically not questioning the political arrangements in those countries and trying to build up the infrastructure of various African regimes. So the Americans are basically saying, well, you stop doing this, otherwise we take you down. And China has had, you know, considerable economic interests in Libya. So the United States focus, Paul Rogers says, is on the Middle East. Al-Qaeda and terrorism is a surrogate for long-term strategic competition with China for the world's oil resources. And here, an interesting green perspective, where they're saying, ironically, it may be China that finally forces the United States to come to terms with the environmental unsustainability of its own economic system. It's worldwatch.org. The bottom line is that China, with its vast population, simply will not be able to follow for long any of the development paths blazed to date, and it will be forced to chart a new course. And then these Greens kind of go off into philosophical la-la land, I think, in a sense, and they say, well, the country that invented paper and gunpowder now has the opportunity to leapfrog the West and show how to build an environmentally sustainable economy. And if it does, China could become a shining example for the rest of the world to admire and emulate, and if it fails, we'll all pay the price. So they're envisaging that it's China that will actually take us into this new green world in the 21st century. But thus far, For example, at the moment, the Chinese are building an eco-city outside Shanghai called Dongtian. And that city is being built by Ovi Arup, which is a Danish firm. And the designs are mostly by an English guy working for this Danish firm. So in other words, the Chinese are doing what the Japanese did 100, 150 years ago, drawing in Western experts. So they're not actually developing these new concepts out of themselves, you see. They're recognizing we have a problem with our economic and environmental development, but we ourselves haven't actually got the means to develop that, so they bring in these Westerners. So that's why I think that part of what these Greens are here saying is unrealistic. But this observation that the sheer size and scale of China may actually be what will force the capitalist world to come to terms with the consequences of its own behaviour. And perhaps we could add financial unsustainability to environmental unsustainability. Because I think we could say that until fairly recently, the Western media did not flag up to Western publics that behind our whole financial crisis in recent years is actually the labour of the Chinese people. That labour created the wealth, which generated the profits, which created the money that then pours into the West. And then these massive surpluses, which then go into the property boom, the internet boom, and all the rest of it, which has happened in the last 10 years. Behind that was all China, but when it was happening in the late 90s, the Western media said almost nothing to the people of the West at that time. Instead, they kept on talking about how the new phenomenon of the internet was creating this kind of, this amazing magic circle of continuous development and growth. Yeah? And this it was a new phenomenon, which could go on and on and on and on. China was somehow left out of that, whereas in fact it's an absolutely integral part of the whole process. And it's only in, I would say, the last, perhaps maybe 5 or 6 years, that the Chinese role in this whole financial situation has really been recognized significantly. So, this situation in which what's happening now, from 1990 to 2014, is mirroring and is being referred to by the elite thinkers of the New World Order elites in the West, between, say, 1890 and 1914, Germany versus the British Empire. And at that time, the British, having recognized that they couldn't split the United States, so if we can't beat and join them, the British elite and the American elite, you would begin to see the beginnings of this symbiotic relationship taking place. So we start to see all this kind of propaganda emerging of Uncle Sam and John Ball getting together in the name of humanity, civilization, peace, resources, industry, food, wealth, kindred interests, English, etc., etc. All the kind of things which Obama and Blair and Brown and Cameron talk about today. That was starting at the turn of the last century. 1902, we get the Pilgrims of Great Britain emerging, a kind of dining group where the transatlantic elite met twice a year together. And this still goes on today. Queen Elizabeth is the patron. And this is one of these means where these two elites sort of bind themselves together. The symbol, perhaps it's a little bit out of focus, I'm sorry, I can't make that any better. The Pilgrims refers to Geoffrey Chaucer, 14th century, English, symbol of English literary culture, the English language, and he's riding a horse, and at that time the power relationship was such that the lion is leading the way and the American eagle's on the rump of the horse. So America's junior partner then. The Latin motto, hic et ubique, here and everywhere. So the British Empire is here and everywhere. And America is coming along with them. And the goal is here, represented here, perhaps you can't see that, it's a ship and a train and a car and the symbols of new technological civilization. So these people are still meeting, and this was one of the first situations where these elites began to meet, just like the Bilderbergers today, you see, on a regular basis. And so this kind of propaganda here with the clear enough what that is. 100 years ago, this sort of thing was pouring out of the presses of the British and American media situation bound up by the Western elites. And to give you a flavour of that, this is Lord Rosebery, who was Prime Minister of England in the 1890s, one of the greatest rhetoricians of the time, public speakers. An address given at Glasgow University in 1900, he was no longer Prime Minister then. He envisaged Britain and America fusing, overcoming what happened in 1776, and the seat of British government being transferred to America, would you believe? So what did he say? And at last, when the Americans became the majority, the seat of empire would perhaps have been moved solemnly across the Atlantic, and Britain had become the historical shrine and European outpost of the world empire. It would have been the most sublime transference of power known to mankind. Our conceptions can scarcely picture the procession across the Atlantic, the greatest sovereign in the greatest fleet in the universe. Not even the whole world, but the universe. Ministers, government, parliament departing solemnly for the other hemisphere under the vigorous embrace of the new world. So this is a British Prime Minister at the height of Britain's imperial power, seemingly, envisaging that we reunite, Britain reunites with its former colony, its rebel colony, and creates one state, do you see? So already envisaging that the British elite and the American elite are basically the same thing. And they have to overcome what happened in 1776-81 and reconnect, rebind, which was also the goal in particular of Cecil Rhodes and later the Round Table. And here we have on the left Theodore Roosevelt, president at the beginning of that century, and on the right Arthur Balfour of the famous Cecil family. Cecil family, right? This family dominated British politics under James I and Queen Elizabeth. He was one of the Cecils who founded the British Secret Service. And at the time, 1900, the Cecil family were the preeminent British family in power. In fact, the Cecils had so much dominance over the British system at that time that the British government was referred to as Hotel Cecil. Yeah? So, the Marquis of Salisbury, who was the leader of the Cecil family, retired in 1902 and simply handed over as Prime Minister to his nephew, Arthur Balfour. And it was during Arthur Balfour's time that the revolution took place in British foreign policy, where the British abandoned splendid isolation and began to make the alliances that were necessary for the preparation for the First World War. Now in 1909, when both of these men were out of office, Balfour felt himself free enough to write a letter to Roosevelt. And this letter is, I think, extraordinarily illuminating. I'll just quote you some bits from it. So here's Balfour writing a letter to Roosevelt. It's quoted from Kenneth Young's biography of Balfour. Universal peace, says Balfour, will come only when these powers, meaning Britain and America, have divided the world between them, or if one nation becomes overwhelmingly superior to the rest. People who can look forward and grasp the essential factors which will govern the future grouping of the nations may be able to exert a profound influence on the political future of the world. In a loose federation, neither, so he's envisaging a federation between Britain and America, which in effect is what we have now, do you see? In a loose federation, there will simply be imposed on English, American, Canadian, South African and Australian national sentiment a common Anglo-Saxon patriotism. If England and America do not federate, the history of the world will continue to be one of warfare, for a number of powers will be competing for supremacy. If they unite against the rest of the world, think about that. If Britain and America unite against the rest of the world, they, Britain and America, will be beyond attack. Such a federation would be a sea empire, today air empire, space empire, with no land borders to defend. It would possess the thinly populated areas and all the seas. And of course, the thinly populated areas would include the minerals and the resources, etc. The Federal Council will only deal with the question of preference and defence. No permanent government would be required. Today we have the Bilderbergers, the Trilaterals and so on. And no permanent government would be required. Such a confederation would be practically unassailable and would dominate the world. It would practically dictate peace by sea to the rest of the world. The balance of power would be permanently upset. And then in 1917, so in the middle of the First World War, at one of those Pilgrim Society dinners I mentioned earlier, Balfour makes a speech. So by this time he was Foreign Secretary in the wartime cabinet, which was dominated by the Round Table during the war, and it was that group of people who ensured that the war did not end in Christmas 1916, but carried on for another 2 years. The Germans offered peace at Christmas 1916. The Round Table members of the British government refused those peace offers in 1916 and pressed ahead to war. And as a result of that, we got the Bolshevik Revolution, and then we got the collapse of Germany, and we got the Weimar Republic, and we got everything else which happened. Right? So this man, Arthur Balfour, was intimately related with these round table groups. The Cecil Bloc, the Cecil group, were an important part of the Round Table, allies of the Round Table group. Balfour says at this speech, "We have not learned freedom from you, nor you from us. We both spring from the same root. Are we not bound together forever? Will not our descendants, when they come to look back on this unique episode in the history of the world, say that among the incalculable circumstances which it produced, the most beneficent and most permanent is perhaps that we are brought together and united for one common purpose and one common understanding, the two great branches of the English-speaking race." Think about that. He's saying the result of this war, in which millions die, is that these two members of the Anglo-Saxon English-speaking people unite as one mighty empire to dominate the world. That's quite a thought. This is the theme, he says, which absorbs my thoughts day and night. I've said, we can think, well, Obama, this is essentially, do you see what Obama said when he came and spoke to the entire British political class in Westminster Hall just a couple of months ago? And they all stood up as one man and applauded him. There was not one person with his backside sitting on a seat. So, nothing has changed since Balfour gave his speech. And Balfour's biographer, who completely agrees with Balfour's worldview in essence, Kenneth Young, writes, "It was a bold and visionary scheme, but not merely an idealistic dream." Certainly not. It was in fact a development of Pax Romana, in which peace was to be, in Balfour's word, legated to the rest of the world, a world government enforced not by tramping legions but by sea, and of course today by drone attack, and by air, and by space, and all the rest of it, and by cyberspace, by missile, by Apache helicopter, by satellite surveillance. Because of course those guys in those days were all public school boys who spent their time studying the classics. So they saw themselves as the inheritance of the Athenian Empire, of the Roman Empire. And the American elite see themselves in the same way today. The president of, one of the presidents at that time, Woodrow Wilson, founder of the Federal Reserve, or founder, I should say, he was the president when the Federal Reserve was introduced underneath him, wrote in his work, The New Freedom, an interesting thing. "Since I entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody. They are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." So he was referring in essence to what he saw as the monopoly power, the great forces who operated from behind the scenes of politics, these conservative, elitist monopolists who were determined to impose legate their imperial will, as it were, on the United States. But he wasn't the first who recognized that in the United States. Go back, 80 years or so, the Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville, in his famous book, Democracy in America, wrote a remarkably prescient thing. And remember, at this time, America was still a very young republic. But de Tocqueville went there, traveled around the United States, and wrote afterwards, I seek to trace the novel features under which despotism may appear in the world. And he really meant despotism in the way we understand it today. The first thing that strikes the observation he meant in America is an innumerable multitude of men, all equal and alike, incessantly endeavouring to procure the petty and paltry pleasures with which they glut their lives. Each of them, living apart, is as a stranger to the fate of all the rest. His children and his private friends constitute to him the whole of mankind. As for the rest of his fellow citizens, he is close to them, but he does not see them. He touches them, but he does not feel them. He exists only in himself and for himself alone. And if his kindred still remain to him, he may be said, at any rate, to have lost his country. And above this race of men stands an immense and tutelary power, which takes upon itself alone to secure their gratifications and to watch over their fate. That power is absolute, minute, regular, provident, and mild. It would be like the authority of a parent if, like that authority, its object was to prepare men for manhood, but it seeks, on the contrary, to keep them in perpetual childhood. It is well content that the people should rejoice, provided they think of nothing but rejoicing. Well, I mean, how prescient is that in what we recognise today in our leisure and pleasure obsessed culture, with all the distractions which we find today. But he saw that in America already, you see, before Hollywood, before Disney, before everything which we know of today that comes from the US. And this was what was on its way in America at that time. I'm just flagging this up here because this, for those of you who are interested, if you want to look into the way in which the British elite prepared the people of Britain at that time for war with Germany, this amazing and extremely thorough book, well worth reading, Scaremongers, The Advocacy of War and Rearmament, 1896 to 1914, by A.J. Morris, who was professor at the University of Ulster. He wrote this in the 1980s. It's incredibly thorough, well documented, and just shows absolutely clearly, no question, step by step from the 1890s, how this was done through the media of that time. Absolutely psychological preparation, propagandizing for war. And the British elite of that time had two fears. There was what you could call the short-term fear, which was Germany, and the long-term fear, which was Russia. The greater fear, in a sense, was Russia. But in order to defend England from this long-term fear, the British elite thought the first thing we have to remove is the German fear. Because you see, around about that time in the 1890s, the Germans were beginning to build the Berlin to Baghdad railway. Now, if you go onto YouTube, and maybe some of you have seen it already, there's a fabulous and extremely funny sort of historical comedy show given by the British comedian Robert Newman called A History of Oil, where he documents the effects of the history of oil on the history of the 20th century, starting with the Berlin to Baghdad railway, and points out how very soon after they got into the war, the British immediately sent a large expeditionary force, mostly from the Indian Army, with some British regiments, to invade Iraq. Why? To protect the oil which the British had already created the British Petroleum Company to gain control of. Because they had only in 1912 transferred the Royal Navy from coal-fired navy to an oil-fired navy. And without the navy, you can't control the world. Right? So we need that oil. And Germany, as you probably know, was also building up a navy. So this was the short-term problem for the British. If the Germans lay the railway to Iraq, then that railway will ensure that eventually the Germans will be able to move into Mesopotamia where the oil is. So that's why Robert Newman argues that in a sense one could see World War I as an invasion of Iraq. That's a more interesting long-term picture of it, you see. The control of oil. But the deeper thing was Russia And what was behind this? And the answer to it we can find, I think, in a place where people don't usually look when they talk about the New World Order today. And that's in this rather strange book, The Transcendental Universe, which was published in 1993, about a series of lectures which were given 100 years earlier, in 1893. So again, we're in the 1890s, you see, by a man called C.G. Harrison, somebody who's very, very difficult to trace. And I've tried as much as I can to get some background on this guy. He's very, very elusive. He dies, I think, in 1929. What we do know about him is an interesting foreword to this book, The Transcendental Universe, which gives as much information as we can get about Harrison to date. But he was clearly somebody who was in the Church of England. He was an esotericist in the Church of England. And he was totally familiar with the occult and esoteric ideas of that period. Completely au fait, familiar with these ideas. And he's giving these lectures on occult science, theosophy, and the Catholic faith as a representative of the High Church of the Church of England. Yeah? So a Protestant Church of England esotericist, a theoretical occultist, if you will. And the Barian Society, again, if you Google Barian Society today, you'll only come across a group of American biblical fundamentalists, and it's not them. This is another Barian Society which probably went out of existence, because I can't track them down anyway. And I haven't come across anybody who has. But these people are clearly interested in these esoteric things, you see. So what was this man Harrison telling these people? Well, one of the things he said was, there are three great axioms which you have to know to understand what's going on in the world. One is that 7 is the perfect number. Everything happens in history and time in numbers in series of 7s at all levels of existence. So if you're trying to understand time and history and evolution, the number 7 is the key. Whether it's the life of a single individual, or whether it's the life of a culture, or whether it's the history of the planet. Secondly, the microcosm is a copy of the macrocosm. Well, we can think of what chaos theory in the 1980s, this idea has now come into conventional natural sciences. Yeah? At all levels of the physical world, one can think of, you get copies at greater levels, whether it goes this way or ever down into lower levels of order. And thirdly, all phenomena have their origins in vortices. So again, this relationship at the periphery to the point. So those are the three principles which he structured these 6 lectures around. And as an example of the first, namely 7 is the key number, he sought to give an example. Well, let me just go back to that a minute so as not to confuse you too much. As an example of 7 being the perfect number, he said, well, first of all, he gave some examples from the natural world. And he said, well, let's look at history and politics and culture. And I'd just like to quote to you a couple of sentences from this book about what he said. And he's basically saying, just as there have been 7 epochs. I told you he was familiar with the theosophical worldview. And the theosophical worldview from Blavatsky, Helena Blavatsky, posits Atlantis and the Atlantean civilization, and then 7 epochs of culture after that. And we today are in the 5th of these 7 epochs. And in the 4th epoch, so that's before our epoch, and our epoch starts in the 15th century. In the 4th epoch, which corresponds to the Greco-Roman time, he's saying what happened was that the Greco-Roman civilization, so for example the Roman Empire and then the Catholic Church, which is the Roman Empire in a new form, acts as the wet nurse or the tutor to the Germanic peoples. So you get the Germanic barbarians and the pagans, and they power into the declining Roman Empire. And then the Roman Empire hands it over to the Catholic Church, and the papacy and the Catholic Church, they take on to educate, to civilize, to wet nurse the Germanic barbarians. The Germanic barbarians then spread all across Europe, right? They go into all these different civilizations. They come to the British Isles, they come to Germany, Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, everywhere. And he says, in the future, the English-speaking peoples will have the same role in relation to the Slavic peoples. And the Slavic peoples, so the Russians and Eastern Europeans, they will be the peoples of the coming sixth epoch. So, fourth epoch, Mediterranean cultures. Fifth epoch, North and Western European. Sixth epoch, Eastern European. In these three epochs, these three groups of people will have the kind of leading responsibility to contribute to the human development, the human process. And that the English-speaking people will have the role of educating, training, bringing up the Slavic peoples, the Russians, for example, in the next epoch. Right? So this is looking long, far in the future, because this sixth epoch will not start until the fourth millennium. Right? And obviously the third has only just begun. So what he says is this. He says that the Slavs are at the moment in their infancy. Western Europeans are accustomed to speak of the barbarism of the Slavs. And in one sense they are right. But our civilization is a mere veneer on the upper classes and is as much a foreign growth as Roman civilization in Britain. Their destiny, the Slavs, is to evolve a higher civilization of their own in the future. Now, here comes the point. The Russian Empire must die so that the Russian people may live. And the realization of the dreams of the Pan-Slavists still will indicate that the sixth Aryan subrace, that's the theosophical jargon, meaning the Slavic people, the people of the sixth epoch, the sixth Aryan subrace has begun to live its own intellectual life and is no longer in its period of infancy. Now, we need not pursue the subject further than to say that the national character will enable them, the Slavs, to carry out experiments in socialism, political and economical, which would present innumerable difficulties in Western Europe. The above are only given as illustrations of a law which is of universal application, is known in occult science as the law of correspondence. So, in other words, the English-speaking peoples must train the Slavs to be as the English-speaking peoples want them to be in the sixth epoch. And this is the message which he's communicating from out of this sort of esoteric background, which is all based on these sevenfold principles. And so here you just see this tabulated. So you've got this is just a theosophical way of looking, or the theosophical esoteric way of looking at evolution since the time of the alleged Atlantean civilization, about 10,000 years ago. You've got that comes to an end with the Great Flood, supposedly, and then we have these 78 ages, each of which last approximately 2,000 years. And you go through these 7 epochs, the Egyptian, Greco-Roman, we are in the Anglo-American era, the Anglo-Germanic era now, which will finish in the 4th millennium. And in these different epochs, different aspects of the human being will be developed. So what we are in the process of developing now is, in the Anglo-Germanic epoch, if you will, is the concept of the self, the individual, separate from the group, separate from the family, separate from the tribe, separate from the collective. Yourself as a being. But that obviously has two sides to it. You can be yourself as personality, or you can be yourself as spiritual individuality. And this is our challenge. Are we going to remain just as personalities, I, myself and me, and I've got my 70 years and then that's it on this planet? Or are we spiritual individualities who are essentially eternal beings and have innumerable lives on this earth? and return to the spiritual world. There's a spiritual perspective, so to speak. Personality, individuality. This is the kind of question which we are faced with in our time. And that has to do with the application of thinking in the fourth epoch, the Greco-Roman time, which is when human beings really began to think for themselves. Well, I shouldn't say for themselves, but human beings began to think intellectually. In our time, we begin to use this thinking to think about, who am I? What is my relationship to the whole? Point, periphery, spiral. Yeah? So the application of thinking, not just to problems of science, technology, social order, structure, but thinking of what is my relationship to the whole. And then in the next so-called Aquarian age, which will be the sixth Slavic epoch, there'll be a new kind of feeling will develop, which will not just be feeling of the individual human being, but the age of brotherhood and sisterhood at a level which we can hardly even conceive of today. And then in the seventh period, the American period, which is meant not so much the United States, but the American peoples as a whole, American continent, then we'll have a new kind of willing will develop, which again is rather difficult to imagine at the moment. Yeah? Not just a personal willing, but a sense in which it will be, as it were, I mean, I'm sure we all saw what happened in China. Remember what happened in China at the Olympics? We see that, the Beijing Olympics. Remember that spectacle? That was an illustration of communal willing of an ancient nature, stemming from the ancient Chinese tradition. Yeah? But imagine that in the far distant future, which will be out of an individual will impulse to act together with one's brothers and sisters, not controlled from outside, but that we all, from within ourselves, will to do that. Yeah? So this is the sort of theosophical picture, or esoteric picture, which Harrison was sort of speaking out of, or describing, because you see, the interesting thing is, he was an enemy of theosophy. He wasn't representing it. He was describing it to the people who he was speaking to. He was not endorsing it. He was saying, this is what the theosophists think. But we, in the Church of England, we have to struggle against that, because he was standing for the supremacy of the English-speaking peoples. And he wanted the English-speaking peoples to go on dominating the world into the future. So we train the Slavs in such a way that they will obey our will, not only in this epoch, but in the next epoch as well. Yeah? A very different perspective. And as an illustration of that, we can see, this is from a British magazine, Truth magazine, interesting, yeah? Truth magazine, Christmas 1890, and you see here, this is the Kaiser of Germany, who dismissed Bismarck in 1890 and took over German government control for himself, and particularly foreign policy determination. And this British magazine, which is coming straight out of this esoteric background, Freemasonic background, imagine that the Kaiser having a dream. And in this dream, he saw the map of Europe in the future, and he saw all the kings and queens of Europe in the future going into the workhouse, in other words, losing their jobs. And all of Europe becoming republics, even Britain. Although interestingly, the Queen of Britain, Victoria at that time, does not go into the workhouse. She's not shown going into the workhouse. Well, that wouldn't have been quite the thing to show, right, in those days. But what we see, I'll show you the blow-up of this map. So here's all the republics, yeah? And how does he describe Russia? Russian desert. So Russia is envisaged not as a republic in the future, but as a desert in the future. And here we see this antipathy towards Russia, and the antipathy towards what Russia represents and what the Russian people are, and what they carry for the future, on the part of the English-speaking elite. That Russia will be made into a desert out of the war which will come. Because here we see the Kaiser leading his generals into war, and the First World War is envisaged in this dream, you see. This is 1890. The Great War is already being imagined by the British elite and their media representatives. And out of this war will come this socialist experiment in socialism that Harrison mentioned in his lectures. Because of this unconscious will impulse to future brotherhood, which was living as a kind of a seed within the souls of the Russian people, but would come to fruition in the distant future. How can we in Britain, the elite, manipulate this in such a way that we can use this to develop socialism in Russia to serve our needs? Yeah? Because only the Russians have something in themselves, the Slavs have something in themselves that enables them to do this. And one of these members of the Round Table Group, a man called John Dove, he said something very interesting in about 1919, which was that you cannot stop a current of world history. If something is to come, it will and must come. So in other words, the Slavs will have their time in the sun, you see. What you can do is you can channel it. You can channel this energy into the direction you want it to go in. So don't try to block it, because that's impossible. Just create a channel into which it will flow. So if the Slavs have an impulse to brotherhood and communal feeling which serves humanity, channel that into socialism, which can then become totalitarianism, which can then be developed as an experimental way to develop systems of social control which will benefit us in the future. And this is what they then did. Now, I'm showing you this picture here of Halford Mackinder, because this man, again, a British, Victorian, Edwardian founder of geopolitics, 100 years ago, is one of the figures who is most often referenced by the American think tankers and foreign policy theorists today. So once again, the Americans are seeing themselves like the British 100 years ago, like the Romans, and Mackinder had this thought that there is something in the world called the heartland. And the heartland is this area of Central Asia and Russia here. And to dominate the world, you must dominate this heartland area. And at the moment, Russia has it. And that's no good, because Britain, with its navy, can't get at it, you see. The Anglo-American powers, we can't get at it. And that's a problem for Britain. Because if we can't do that, then we can't control the heartland. And if you control the heartland, you control Eurasia. And if you control Eurasia, you control what Mackinder called the world island, which is Eurasia and Africa. And if you control that, you control the world. Yeah? So he said, the important thing to control is the first important thing to control is the jumping off point, which is the Balkans. So the Balkans is the bridgehead to control of Central Asia. So first you gain control of the Balkans, and then you can control Central Asia. And if you control Central Asia, then you've controlled the heartland. And if you control the heartland, then you control Eurasia. And if you control Eurasia, you control the world. Well, what do we see happen in the 1890s? The Balkans. And now we have in Kosovo, which you remember was supposed to be this great struggle for freedom and democracy and so on and so forth. We now have the biggest American base in the world almost, Camp Bond Steel, sitting on the oil pipelines which are bringing the oil from the Caspian region from there into Europe, right? So there they are in the Balkans, and they're planning to move their missile systems and so on, NATO, into Eastern Europe. And now, of course, they've now got their camps and their military bases in Iraq, and then they move them into Central Asia. So clearly they're not going to be giving up, they're not going to be moving all their troops out of Afghanistan. They're going to stay there. They are there where they were never before. So if you read, for example, Zbigniew Brzezinski, his book, The Grand Chessboard, 1997, early on in the book he's quoting from Halford Mackinder from 100 years ago. And these very axioms of Mackinder.
Sorry, Terry, just
Yeah.
a question.
Yeah.
Why don't Russia control the whole world then if they're control the heartland?
Sorry?
You said whoever controls the heartland
Yes.
can control the whole world.
Yes.
Well, why don't Russia control the whole world then, since they control the heartland?
Russia don't control the whole world because of who the Russians are.
They don't have
They
the
don't want to
understanding.
control the whole world. They don't
Right.
see themselves as the new Roman Empire. The English-speaking people see themselves as the new Roman Empire.
So if you wanted to control the whole world, you'd have to control the heartland.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and that's what then and now the English-speaking elite are seeking to do. Yeah? And Mackinder, first of all, he posed this as the heartland, but then he extended it in 1919 to include Eastern Europe. Now look at this boundary line he gives you. It's exactly the boundary line which you get in 1945, when Germany is split, and this is controlled by the Soviet Union, and this is controlled by the West. This is the Cold War border in 1945, and I put there 1919 because in 1919, one of the men who he worked with, Lord Milner, fingered Konrad Adenauer, who was then a young, uprising mayor, the mayor of Cologne in Germany. And Milner said, this is the guy we need to enforce our will in Germany, already in 1919. And then, of course, Adenauer then becomes Chancellor of Germany after World War II. So they've already got figured out who are the individuals they need to place in power later on. So, this I already mentioned. The Economist in 1990, this is. September 1st to the 7th of September 1990. We see cover Saudi prince, symbol of Saudi aristocracy, traditional culture, the falcon hawking, the old order passes. Well, this is exactly what's happening now, right? The old order is being taken down now. They were already flagging it up then. And here we see this innocuous thing, a new flag, a survey of defence and democracies. And you open this magazine and you see this. This is a special 16-page spread. Now what's that about? This new flag. What is the new flag? Well, it's clearly, from one perspective, the EU flag, the European flag, inside the American flag. So, little sister inside big brother. Yeah? And this is just the week before George Bush Sr. gives his famous speech announcing the New World Order. When he spoke those words to Congress. And in that issue of the Economist, you get this new picture of the world in the post-communist, post-Cold War era. The world according to culture, ideology of spiritual philosophy, if you will. So we see Euro-America is one unit and is divided and separated from Euro-Asia. So the Protestant and Catholic world has become one. Islamistan has become one, all the Muslim world. Hindu land is cultured by itself, and Confuciania is one. Japan, China, Korea, basically China and its satellites. So that's at the time of the New World Order speech, 3 years before Huntington's famous book, Clash of Civilizations. And in a week later, just by the by, you have the United Nations Resolution 666 happened to be passed in relation to the build-up to the Iraq War, first Gulf War. So the European divide, the Cold War, had only just been overcome. The wall had only just gone down, and already the Anglo-American elite are creating a new divide between West and East. Yeah? And now we come to this thing which relates directly to today. Because at the end of 1992, The Economist, at the end of the year they always do a kind of special issue, the New Year issue. And this is always very interesting to follow this particular issue. And they looked at the history of the next 50 years from 1992 from the perspective of 2,992, 1,000 years in the future. But in fact, the only bit they were really looking at was the next 50 years. And what were they saying in there? They presented it in a slightly humorous way, as they often do. But you see, the subtitle, A World History, Chapter 13, The Disastrous 21st Century. Now, I don't have the time today to go into this, but I wrote about it in my book, Mapping the Millennium, in some detailed analysis of this article. Because this title, this article is full of symbolic semiotic references to all kinds of things. And this title is one of them, numerological references in particular. This is a reference to the book, The Distant Mirror, by the American historian Barbara Tuchman. The Distant Mirror, the calamitous 14th century. 14. The disastrous 21st century. Yeah? 7, 14, 21. The sevenfold way of looking at history again. So they're posturing the 21st century as a disaster. And why will it become a disaster, they say? Well, it will be a disaster because in the year 2011, all hell will begin to break loose. And this all hell will start with a military coup in Saudi Arabia. Where you can think, okay, well here we are in 2011, no coup in Saudi Arabia, so they got that one wrong. But hang on a minute, you know, what has happened in Egypt? Yeah, I mean, who's now ruling Egypt? It's the military, right? So okay, perhaps they got one country wrong there, but we're not at the end of 2011 yet. We've still got 6 months of something that can happen in Saudi Arabia, so we need to keep our eyes fixed on that. And it's very interesting to see how the Western media, as yet, have said very, very little about Saudi Arabia. They've been rather stum about that. But there's a sense in which, as they said, the old order passes. The autocrats of these Arab countries served the English-speaking world against communism. We don't need them anymore. So now we're put into power democratic stooges who will serve the interests of the West. And we'll pass this off as freedom and democracy. So this coup will take place, the coup of Colonel al-Busaybi in Saudi Arabia 2011. And then he quickly takes control of almost all the Gulf's oil because he could point Muslims towards a new geopolitical target. And by 2011, Muslims felt that at last they had a chance to work off their ancient resentment against the now splintered Western world. And the revolutionaries in ex-Saudi Arabia, now the Islamic Republic of Arabia, offered to share the Gulf's oil wealth with other Muslims in return for a foreign policy alliance in a joint army. So what they're flagging up here is that from 2011 onwards, we'll begin to see a new movement whereby the Muslims all come together in one group. Now, what could that mean? Now, what does this group then do? This Muslim entity, let's call it that because that's what they call it elsewhere, this new Muslim entity or superpower will then ally itself, according to them, with China. And then this collection, this alliance, this Muslim entity and China will then attack, will move west. But who will they attack? Well, you might think, well, Muslims, they're bound to attack Israel, sort out the Palestine problem. But no, the Economist says nothing about Israel in this article. Well, perhaps you might not be surprised by that because, you know, the Rothschilds own a large percentage of the shares, in the 50% of the shares in The Economist, which are not controlled by Pearson, a British company, sort of print publishing and educational conglomerate Pearson. They own 50% of The Economist shares. The other 50% are owned by private investors, and in that group, the Rothschilds own a very large block, and Lady Linda Rothschild sits on the board. Okay, so, all right, maybe it's no surprise they don't mention Israel. But they say that they will turn west. The Chinese and the Muslims will turn west. And who will they destroy, do you think, if they're not attacking Israel? Any guesses? Europe. But who in Europe?
Russia.
Exactly. They will turn on what he calls here the decaying corpse of Russia. So again, this bitter, cynical way in which Russia is referred to by the media representatives of the English-speaking elite. Russia will be attacked. Russia will be turned on. The first victim was China. The first victim was Turkey, a country accused of betraying its fellow Muslims in pursuit of a false Western idea of democracy. But the main target was the decaying corpse of Russia, itself a fragment of the broken Soviet Union. And here, the new caliphate, that's this united Muslim world. The new caliphate found the basis for the alliance with China that lasted for the next 2 centuries. And what this new alliance would do was that it would emerge. This is one of the illustrations that went with this article. You see this dragon moving over the Great Wall of China, using this Muslim oil and taking on the Russian bear. And then the country, which in a sense would play a key role in this whole process, is Uzbekistan, which is specifically mentioned in this article, and which Zbigniew Brzezinski in the Grand Chessboard pays particular attention to Uzbekistan, because in Uzbekistan is a movement which the Western media, because it's focused mostly on the Muslim Brotherhood at the moment, has tended to wander away from, and that's a group which calls itself Hizb ut-Tahrir, the Party of Liberation. Hizb ut-Tahrir. Hang on, heard that before somewhere. Tahrir. Tahrir? Tahrir, anybody? No? Tahrir Square?
Yeah.
Cairo, Egypt? Yeah. The Hizb ut-Tahrir party are strongest in Uzbekistan, but this party exists everywhere where there are Muslims. Yeah? And this party's goal is the creation of a new caliphate. Not by terrorism, so they say, but by reasoned argument. Just like the Marxists would have said 100 years ago, by reasoned argument we persuade the working classes to see the sense of Bolshevik International. So they are looking to re-establish the will disappear from Russian control, and Russia will effectively, according to this picture, become a European state, a European entity. So here you've got the money powers of Europe who will basically stand off and watch this happening. Right? So Russia will be, as it were, squashed between the Europeans who will not lift a finger to help them, and the alliance of China and the Muslim world who will turn on Russia. Now if you consider that in this picture of this future, right, this esoteric picture I presented earlier, of preventing the Russians from doing in the future what they need to do. You have a picture of, in this case, the Russians are in the vice. From this, the Westerners who don't do anything, and the Easterners who are hammering Russia in the middle. So Russia is then reduced to a European state. Now, if we go back 800 years, we have a similar kind of, interestingly, a kind of similar situation. Only here you've got the Western Crusaders attack the Middle East from the west. The Mongols, the Far Easterners, attack the Middle East from the east. And the Muslims were in the middle. Right? So after Russia, which is at the moment in the middle, so to speak, after this bridging entity has been reduced, and then again you will end up with from your perspective, the Europeans, the Westerners, the Americans and Europe, the transatlantic forces, and on the other side you'll have the Chinese and these forces. And then the Muslim world will be in the middle, do you see? So when that situation happens, then the Muslim world will be in the vice situation. So where we are now, in the so-called Arab Spring, it's possible, and I just raised this as a sort of hypothesis really, for your consideration. These old dictators who served the West in the Cold War, they are now being forced out. But if you think back to 1917, imagine if we'd had television in the spring of 1917, right? We would have been told by the television, the BBC in 1917, that, hey, remarkable popular uprising is taking place on the streets of Petrograd. Yeah? Democracy and freedom are coming to the Tsarist autocracy. Wonderful. Now our allies in the First World War will be Democrats like us. Yeah? And so the Tsar, the old order, is taken down. And then what we find is that the government of the provisional government of Russia, the new so-called democracy, is stuffed full of Freemasons who were doing the bidding of London and Paris, their brethren in London and Paris, to continue the war against Germany. But a month later, America came into the war with all its resources and all its money. So now, London and Paris don't really need Russia again in order to fight Germany. See? So then what happens is that London and Paris and America arrange it so that Trotsky can be allowed to enter Russia from America, where he was then living. So the Germans enable Lenin to get into Russia, and the British and the Americans enable Trotsky to get into Russia. And then the Bolshevik Revolution can happen. And it's Trotsky who's the key, because Lenin was just, in a sense, he was the guy who stayed in the city and just thought about things. It was Trotsky who was the guy who organized the Bolshevik Civil War and victory actually on the ground. He was the organizing genius of the Russian Civil War. And he was allowed to get back to Russia by the Brits and the Americans. So Kerensky, who headed the democratic governments, so-called, Freemasonic dominated governments, in the spring of 1970, he was ousted by these guys in the autumn, Trotsky and Lenin. Yeah. So now, today, we're all looking at, will Egypt become, for example, a democratic country in September with elections and so on? Or will something else happen? Will the Muslim Brotherhood, or will some perhaps from behind the scenes, so to speak, Hizb ut-Tahrir or some other similar movement calling for Muslim unity emerge? The feelings of all those young Muslims on the street, what is it that they're really going to respond to? We're being told that they're being responding to Facebook and Twitter and Madonna and Lady Gaga, and that's what they really want, But is that what they really want? After all these decades of humiliation at the hands of the West.
Well, it's going to turn into the jihad.
Well,
take it on board.
Okay, so that's the point, yeah? Is what we're going to get, jihad, instead, yeah? In a new form. So we're coming to the final part. So Robert Kaplan here is one of those who is really looking towards war with China. And eventual war with China, you see. So in other words, he's seeing, as The Economist does, a new bipolar order, do you see? Just like in the 20th century we had East versus West, capitalism versus communism. Now they're looking to basically capitalist, self-centered individualism versus Chinese collectivism in the future. And so he wrote this book in 2002, Warrior Politics, because of course for him, Christianity, that's just passé, that's finished. So why leadership demands a pagan ethos? Yeah? Again, like the Romans, like the Greeks, we have to go back to this Roman thing and be utterly ruthless to those who do not agree with us in order to establish our will. And this is what he's saying, Kaplan. Yeah? He's saying we must gain control of the Indian Ocean because this is going to be the key place for the future. Why? Because the Indian Ocean is, as it were, the forecourt of Central Asia. Remember Mackinder and the Heartland? Yeah? If you don't control the Indian Ocean and the various bases around it, then you cannot supply what's going on inland. Yeah? And I would draw your attention to two things. One is the piracy that's going on here, conveniently, which has now drawn the NATO navies into this region. Nice convenient excuse. So all these navies which serve the interests of the United States, which are never in this region, the Danish Navy, all these allies of the US are drawn into this area because of these pirates. And where are the deals done? Where are the deals done where the pirates are paid off and they take hostages? Where does this happen? Where are all the experts who do the mediating? Anybody know? Well, surprise, surprise, London, of course. And this place here, Gwadar, this is a very important place. This is a port in Pakistan built by the Chinese. And then here's another Chinese port, Hambantota in Sri Lanka. Do you remember the whole thing with the Tamil Tigers and the civil war in Sri Lanka? What was that about? Right? If you go back and you look at the BBC and how they reported that struggle, the Sri Lankan civil war, you will find a steady prejudice or inclination on the side of the BBC to propagandize on the behalf of the Tamil Tigers against the Buddhist central government of Colombo. And why? Because that central government is allied to the Chinese. So that whole struggle is part of this new game which is being played out in the Indian Ocean. Right? 2006, US Armed Forces Journal, we see yet another map emerging of what they want to see happening in this whole region from Syria to Pakistan. And we see how some countries are reduced in size, some grow. And from the point of view of the West, what they want to see emerging is a much reduced Pakistan. And then, hey presto, a new state emerges, which is called Free Baluchistan. And an important place in Free Baluchistan is the port of Gwadar. In fact, it's the only place which is mentioned in this Free Baluchistan. And guess where the center of the Free Baluchistan movement is in the world? Anybody want to hazard a guess on that one? London, exactly. Yeah. That's where the headquarters is of the Free Baluchistan movement. Check it out from the West. Go check out the Free Baluchistan movement. And because they know how to... Brzezinski refers to this whole region as the Central Asian Balkans. Remember again the First World War 100 years ago and how the Great War emerged out of the ethnic problems of the Balkans. Now they refer to this area as the Balkans. And so you use the various ethnic groups within Pakistan against each other. So you use the Balukis to divide Pakistan. That's on its way. And there's the struggle going on at the moment is between these two pipelines. The so-called Tapi pipeline from north-south, bringing Turkmen gas through Afghanistan, Pakistan, through the planned Free Baluchistan, out through Gwadar, into the Western-controlled Indian Ocean, and then to the west. And then there's the other east-west pipeline going from Iran through Pakistan into India. Now you can imagine that the West does not want this pipeline to succeed. It does not want connections to be made friendly connections between Iran and India, because the West wants to gain control of India for its eventual struggle against China. Right? That's why Bush went to India several years ago and sold them the nuclear power deal. Remember that? So this pipeline, the Americans tried to do this deal with the Taliban in 1999. And there was the famous thing of, well, either we can bury you with gold or we can bury you with bombs, which is it to be? And the Taliban said, we don't want a deal, thank you very much. So the Americans, okay. And then we got 2001, 9/11, and then the invasion of Afghanistan. But now it looks like the Afghan war is winding down. We're told that peace is about to happen with the Taliban. And just several months ago, this deal was done again, as it were. So the Tapi pipeline is once more very much on the cards. The original American aim. So Robert Kaplan, May-June 2010, Foreign Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, leading American foreign policy think tank. He wrote this front page article, China's Grand Map, How far will Beijing reach on land and sea? Well, look at this here. A little article here called Why Russia Should Join NATO by Charles Kupchan. Interesting. Russia joining NATO. What's that about? Kaplan envisages this is China's sphere of influence as he sees it. And then these are the two countries, India and Japan, who will oppose that Chinese influence. So these are the two countries which the West wishes to gain control of in its eventual struggle against China. Charles Kupchan, why Russia should join NATO? Kupchan. Now, this is Charles Kupchan here. He's a kind of acolyte, if you will, of Henry Kissinger. Yeah? And so he's suggesting that Russia should join NATO. These two guys, William Drozdiak and Richard Rosecrans, in the same issue, the very same issue of that magazine, these two guys suggested that NATO and the European Union should become the same thing. Right? So NATO should become really the army of the European Union, the global police force. And that the financial systems of America and the European Union, in effect, should be really fused. So you see, in that one issue of the Council of Foreign Relations, Foreign Affairs magazine, you have a picture laid out there that America and the European Union fuse, NATO becomes the military arm of the European Union, Russia is invited to join the European Union. Remember what I said about eventually Russia will become a European state. Well, you're a European state now, come join us. Yeah? And you can fight with us against the enemy beyond the Urals. These guys got together at a meeting at the Levin Institute at the State University of New York last year. Kissinger, Brent Scowcroft, he was in the Bush 1 government. They were all there and talking about these various scenarios. So we see there a picture of transatlantic European Union relationship coming together and preparing for a war against the Chinese. Now, this is what's being prepared, folks. So I'm saying, if you can imagine that if you could see, if we could have seen, say, in 1910, 1909, if we'd really been awake to follow the deliberations of the Round Table movements and read their magazines and what they were planning and how they were describing Germany, we could have seen that war was on the cards. Do you see? And then you could ask, okay, well, what could we have done about it? That's a moot point. But the problem was that not enough people were aware of that, what the ruling groups in the West were actually planning. And then that war broke out in 1914, which affected the destinies of millions and millions and millions of people, if you then think of World War II coming out of World War I. No World War I, no Hitler, no Stalin, no Trotsky, no Bolshevik Revolution, no, etc. All the consequences that followed from World War I. And that happened because the peoples of the West were not sufficiently alert to what the picture that their leaders had of the coming century. And I think we're now in a similar situation, which one can see from the pictures of our leaders today. There's a whole bunch of documents of all kinds where you see this image of Atlantis, of the Atlanticism being resurrected, where across the Atlantic, which the British elite like to refer to the pond, Europe and America being knitted together for this eventual bipolar struggle. And that happens at the elite level, and it also happens at the popular level. Atlantis rising, Stargate, and so on and so forth. I'm going to finish off. In fact, just take some questions after that. Okay. So this message is being given. The concept of Atlantis is given to appeal to the feelings of people, the semi-conscious and unconscious feelings, these yearnings of sentiment and nostalgia for something they dimly understand but sense from the ancient past. It touches the feelings of people, yeah? And so makes them look towards the Atlantic region and Atlantic consciousness. Whereas the elite have this other picture of what they mean by the Atlantic, reforging the transatlantic relationship, NATO, the European Union, Atlantic Community, and so on and so forth. Yeah? Power politics. So you get a well-meaning man like Assistant Professor of Chinese at the University of Pennsylvania, Dirk Bodie, saying things like, relations between nations today reveal how meagre is their understanding one of the other. The greatest crisis before our country lies in this gap between our control of things and understanding of other peoples. The future of civilization may depend on whether enough nations and groups within nations can acquire an understanding and appreciation of one another to the point where world peace is possible. Yeah. So if only we can understand the Chinese better, then, and understand, for example, how Chinese, the Chinese invented the civil service and the examination system, and that has helped our culture. And if we understand that, then, world peace will become possible. We think about them in not a good way. I would suggest that's not going to be enough. Millions and millions and millions of dollars have already been spent by American research groups and think tanks and all kinds of things in order to study Far East and culture. And they, still America and China are doing this, it's quite obvious. And the situation is actually getting worse. And of course people will say, yeah, but hang on, what about the economy? American and Chinese economy like this, how could they possibly go to war together? They depend on each other, right? Yeah, they're not going to give up this mutually profitable relationship. But then in 1909, 1910, the leading economic journalist of the day, Norman Angell, wrote a book called The Grand Illusion, in which he said, in the modern world, the leading economies of the advanced nations like Britain and Germany are so intermeshed and interdependent and locked together, war between these two is absolutely unthinkable. And his book was stuffed full of statistics, as you might imagine. A very economically literate person. His book was a bestseller, was translated in all European languages, and everybody thought, war between two countries doing such business together, impossible. Well, 4 years after that book was published, boom. Because what goes on at this level is ultimately not what really is affecting things. It's what's happening at unseen levels of feeling and will, coming out of the unconscious, which are manipulated from certain directions, which have a stronger impact. And 3 short final quotes. From 3 characters from that period. In fact, I think I'll miss the first one. I think we've got time for that. But Tang Liang Li, a Chinese guy who later became an important person in the 1930s in Chinese politics, and actually collaborated with the Japanese, so he's regarded as a traitor by the Chinese communists today. But he was very active at that time. And he said, in 1926, he said the following, just bear with me for a minute because I'm sort of translating here. He said, for a China which pays attention to itself, the atmosphere in Geneva, this is when, in the aftermath of World War I, the Allies were figuring out what to do with Geneva. So he's referring back to about the early 1921 period. He said, the atmosphere of Geneva has become unbearable. It's become so unbearable that the exit from the League of Nations, which is mostly a league of the states of Europe and of Latin America, is the only possible solution for China. So he's saying China has been so disrespected in the League of Nations that really the only thing we can do is leave the League of Nations. After 15 years of chaos and confusion, the revolution which broke out, the Republican Revolution which broke out in 1911, has resulted in a victorious conclusion. He supported that revolution. But out of the half-colonial position after this half semi-colonial position which it finds itself in, young China, despite the monstrous difficulties it's been faced with, and which now still oppose it, thanks to its own powers, has become a great power in the world, which, with the forces of its own people, and with its own rich sources of aid, which it aids itself, has become an important factor in world history and will be in the future. Whether China's important influence will now be used for good or for evil, for war or for peace, in the balance of history, will depend, that the powers of the West will have to decide. Because if you continue to treat us with this disrespect you've treated us since the Opium Wars, and which you've just shown us again, because basically the West backed off and said to Japan, okay, you do what you want in China. And the Chinese Republicans were not impressed with that. So he's saying already in 1926, you treat us with disrespect, we're going to come after you, in effect. And another voice from India, Rabindranath Tagore, the poet, he spoke about Japan at this similar period, and he was basically saying, I'll sort of paraphrase here, he was saying basically that Japan is become a modern culture, the most modern culture in Asia, but it's still in its emotional life is part of Asia. Though it's very westernized, it's part of Asia. And the whole of Asia is looking to Japan to behave in a responsible way, which will serve the causes of Asia and not betray the spiritual traditions of Asia. And he says here, from all the countries of Asia, you in Japan, you have of all the countries in Asia, you in Japan have the freedom. Now please imagine, substitute China now instead of Japan, because China's in the position, in a certain sense, that Japan was, as the leading Asian country. That you are in the position which you have gained from your own being, and you're in the position where you can act according to your own inner self and according to your own requirements. You have the fortune not to be constrained from the outside. Therefore, is your responsibility all the greater. For you answer in the name of the whole of Asia to the question which is put before, which Europe has put before humanity. In your country, the attempt will be made through which the East will change the picture of modern civilization, insofar as your country breathes the life which can change the culture of the West, which the West has created, which is a machine culture. And in place of that, you, Japan, have the possibility of placing human feelings without cold calculation, instead of valuing only power and success. And therefore you can help human civilization to develop in the direction of harmonious growth, truth and beauty. So he's saying to Japan, please don't behave like the Westerners, only in terms of power and success. But unfortunately the Japanese did what they did. Yeah? And in a sense, China is now faced with this same temptation, you see. And that leads me to the final quote, which is from Rudolf Steiner in 1921 again. Again, please think of, he's talking about Japan, because Japan was facing this temptation then, but please substitute China today, because I think the situation is not essentially different. It's an interesting quote, so I'll just quote the whole thing. Japan is in the vanguard of Asian life in a sense. It's taken up outer European forms the most. One can deal with Japan in terms of treaties, alliances in the way the West is used to do. But in its concept of the folk soul, Japan remains bound up with the general life of Asia. Asia inherited an ancient spiritual life which is more important to it than anything. This spiritual life will explode in mighty flames if relationships are not created by the West, which can satisfy it, which cannot satisfy the spiritual life of Asia. Yet it is thought in the West that such relationships can be grounded merely in economics. This attitude will only result in the creation of the preconditions for more terrible catastrophe than the European war was. The circumstances of social life which span the world today cannot be conducted without the input of a spiritual impulse. The people of Asia will go along in sympathy with the West, and this is the key thought here. The peoples of Asia will go along in sympathy with the West when the people of the West brings to it ideas of a general human character that speak of the human being in relation to the world and how social life should be organized appropriately in relation to these world relationships. So, social life with a moral, ethical basis. When the East can see how in the West new ideas about things exist that the ancient culture knows of, but for which there is a vague stirring for renewal, the East will come to a sympathetic cooperation with the West. But when the West's input in public affairs is seen in the East as the fantastical ideas of impractical people, then the East will make war upon the West. So in other words, Asia is looking to Europe, to the West, to come up with social and economic ideas that have a moral and ethical heart, that they can understand in terms of their traditional spirituality. And as long as we don't come up with something like that, and we only come up with an economics based on the desires and needs of me, myself and I, although it might look like the Chinese at the moment seem to want that as well, that was how it looked in Japan in the 1920s and 30s, do you see? When Japanese industry was churning along and they were developing their capitalist culture and so on. But then along came Pearl Harbor and yeah. So at a deeper level, the Japanese were actually wanting something else from the West. And the Chinese are wanting it too. And the last point I'll just make is, I'm just going to skip a couple of things here. The last point, which I think the thing that we need to think about in terms of this spiritual connection is the question of reincarnation, because it's not enough only to understand, how has China helped the West in the past. Yeah, the West. At the moment, what we're seeing in the West is ideas about reincarnation are starting to re-emerge in the West. But there are spiritual teachers in the East, both in China and in Korea, and in Japan, who teach that Chinese are only reincarnated as Chinese, and Japanese are only reincarnated as Japanese. In other words, the blood. So if they keep pushing that kind of idea, Falun Gong, you've probably heard of that, right? This group which the Chinese government was so afraid of. Yeah? Well, the leader of that group is in New York. He teaches that Chinese reincarnate only as Chinese. That's dangerous, because if that idea is taken up by the Chinese people, and the Japanese people, that will tell them that we are always Chinese and Japanese, you see. We'll lock them into the bloodline, into the culture, and we'll make for a continuous opposition between the East and the West. So the idea of reincarnation, that you can be reborn if you're Chinese this time as a Westerner, as an African, as whatever, is really, really important. And we're starting to see, particularly with children in the West, how they're starting to remember their previous lives. There's some very interesting examples of this on the internet. So, in the long run, I would say that this spiritual dimension is really key. Because until the Chinese people, who have such a strong relation to their past in terms of their family and their bloodline, can see that that is not the only thing. Just as in the West, we only have one life, and then after that, that's it. So I have to have my selfish desires now and satisfy them now, and the Chinese are in the way, so we have to destroy them, right? And in the China, it's always, we're always Chinese, and always will be, and the Westerners are opposing our national glory, which I identify with because I'm Chinese and always will be, then that will cause severe problems. But this re-emergence of a new concept of reincarnation in the West, I think is very hopeful. And in the long run is, I think, perhaps the best hope for peace between these two parts of the world. So I think I'm going to stop there, and thank you for your patience. And if there's any questions, I'll be happy to take them.
You mentioned number 11 in relation to the base of the Statue of Liberty, and it's just something that a lot of people are curious about. I wonder if you have any quick thoughts on that as well, in relation to how the number 11 is used, has been used seemingly, from the Apollo missions to the 9/11 as a vehicle for what seemed like hoaxes, and it's just maybe it's
the cult significance of
yeah. There's a lot of knowledge around the number 11, even but as a sort of used negatively as a vehicle for these things, like in the Tree of Life, the Kabbalah, it's there, but it's kind of a pathway where two elements can coexist as one. And I'm just wondering if you had any more thoughts on that.
Well, one thing I think I would want to say is that you'll find on the web, and people are interested in these things, often the assertion that, for example, the number 33 is just 3 11s.
Yeah.
So they see 33 as, they've decided that 11 is bad, so they see 33 as just 11 3 times. Whereas I don't think that's correct at all. The number 33, what is at the base of 33 is the number 3, and that's the really important thing about the number 33. But I mean, what's interesting to me about number 11 is, for example, in the English-speaking world, where you see it in sport. All the team sports where you've got the 11, right? Cricket 11, the football 11, and so on. And that then has this relationship to the English-speaking world, I think, particularly. And well, I can't help but be reminded of the Last Supper after the 12 disciples, when Jesus sends Judas out. So Judas then steps out of the circle of 12, and circle of 12, so the periphery with Jesus in the centre, so to speak. But then out of that circle of 12, there's one missing now. And what does that mean? That circle is in a sense broken. So when the 12-foldness is broken by the one stepping out, I think that's very mysterious, because you can ask, well, who is that one who's stepping out? And what is the relationship between, say, Judas and in the zodiacal circle of 12, say, for example, the sign of Scorpio? Who is the 11th? Who is the 11th, or the 12th, as it were, who steps out so that there are now 11, and that the circle is temporarily broken?
And you mentioned last time about actually adding another person, the 13 signs in the zodiac, or again breaking that 12.
Breaking the 12ness, yes.
For the Freemasons, is the Kabbalah, important? Is that related to? Because I know 11. I mean, 22 seems to be their number of perfection in the Kabbalah, from what I know, is fairly superficial, and 11 is sort of halfway there, and it's sort of the second most, desirable number in some way. It's a number. You're halfway to perfection. You've achieved a certain amount.
But that means that if you're halfway to, it's like in a certain way, it's like the seventh in music, isn't it? If you're talking base 12, then 11 is 999. Decimal system 999. It's the seventh, the interval of the seventh. It's that tension. It's not completion. It's that constant tension. So you're in that sort of musical tension space, in a sense, in base 12 at 11, right? Like 999 is in base 10, or 666 is in base 7. So your other question about the Masons and the Kabbalah, I mean, one of the points that Steiner brought forward was this: if you see, think of these two snakes going around the caduceus, right? If you just think of this again as a hypothesis, right? If you consider the central straight vertical there as, let's call that the sun stream, S-U-N, but also S-O-N in the sense of esoteric Christianity, then around that are these two other streams, yeah, and which are in essence Buddhism and Islam, right? But by Buddhism and Islam, those two religions are really representatives of culture. So when Islam engaged with the West, with the Christian world, it wasn't just Islam that it brought the entire culture of the Near East. So Persia, Babylonia, Syria, that whole world, which you could describe as moon culture from a certain perspective, you see? And his point was that moon culture interacted with Europe, the European culture, from the time, for example, of Muhammad until approximately 1300, right? So those two cultures then interact and conflict and confront and so on. And out of this friction comes a learning, in fact, yeah, particularly from the West. And what the West learned from that was particularly natural science.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? So we learn from the moon culture carried by Islam. That whole cultural world, we learned especially natural science. But he's saying from 1800, another stream will come in, and this is what he calls the Mercury stream. You can think of that as the other snake. And I'm not seeing these two snakes in a negative way. I'm just seeing this threefoldness, do you see? It's a balance and then something in the middle. Yeah? And that other stream is born by Buddhism. So the West begins to learn about Buddhism from approximately 1800 onwards. But it's not just Buddhism. It's that whole world from India to Japan. And all those spiritual streams have now been interacting with the West since 1800. And Steiner's point was one of the main things which we in the West will learn from that stream is karma and reincarnation. Yeah. So in terms of your question, the Kabbalah is part of the esotericism of the moon stream, the Semitic peoples, right? Mm-hmm. Freemasonry is focused on the temple, the wisdom of the Temple of Solomon. Egypt. All of that is coming from the Near East, which is this moon stream, right? And then we're about to now interact for a further period of about 600 years with this Far Eastern stream, from India to Japan.
Could I just ask one final question? So, in a lot of the presentation, there's a sort of a belt, you know, of geography and influences. And one thing which seems to be missing is Africa. I'm just wondering, has their time, you know, in the esoteric sort of realm, have they been, or are they, you know, coming, or where are they at the moment? Do you have any idea about that?
Okay. Well, right. We can first of all say, well, what is the most important part of human life? And that might seem a daft question, but in a sense, well, what do you think? What is the most important part of human life? What are the three fundamental things which everybody in this room did? All of us, without exception.
We're born.
Well, of course we were born, yeah, but I mean, you know, but then we did three things. We're born, and then we do three things.
Walk, speak, and think.
Exactly. Yeah. We learn to walk, we learn to speak, we learn to think. The original Trinity, you might say. And if we screw up there, in walking, speaking, and thinking as human beings, the rest of our life is devastated. And from the time of Freud onwards, people, you know, scientists and psychologists and psychiatrists recognize the importance of what happens in childhood, early childhood learning. So that's the foundation point of humanity. And even now, natural scientists, anthropologists have come to the point paradoxically recognizing that the Adam and Eve story is in fact true. In fact, they even say humanity starts with a woman in Africa. Yeah? That thought came out, I can't remember exactly when it was, but a couple of decades ago. Yeah? That they recognize that humanity starts, its roots are in Africa. So every people has a role to play in the story. Yeah? And the role of childhood is supremely important.
So what you're saying is the Africans were the children.
I'm saying, well, okay, well, right?
Well,
Yeah, right. I'm saying that, but then what does that mean? That one looks down on Africans
No.
because they stand at the